Bill stands in the quiet dust of his garage, his thumb tracing the jagged dent on a rusted steel helmet. To his neighbors, he is just the old man who waves from the porch. But the faded white paint on the helmet's rim remembers him differently. It remembers him as a coxswain, a boy of 20 entrusted to steer a Higgins boat through the iron surf of Normandy. The garage is warm, smelling of dried grass and gasoline. But Bill shivers. The steel in his hands feels unnaturally cold, carrying the same chill it held on that gray morning of June 6th, 1944. He grips the rim tighter, and suddenly, the concrete floor beneath his slippers seems to heave. It is no longer solid ground. It is a wet, wooden deck, lurching violently in the English Channel. He closes his eyes, and the hum of the refrigerator fades away. In its place comes the roar of diesel engines screaming against the waves, and the sickening thud of water slamming against the ramp. He isn't looking at a shelf of tools anymore. He is staring through a slit in the armor plate, watching the bluffs of Omaha Beach grow larger through the smoke. His hands, now spotted with age, instinctively curl as if gripping a wheel. He is not holding a souvenir. He is holding the only thing that stood between his skull and the Atlantic wall. The ramp is about to drop, and Bill is terrified all over again. Before the garage and the gray hair, Bill was just a boy from Wisconsin. He came from a place where winter snowdrifts sometimes stood taller than he did, and summers smelled of cut hay drying in long, bright rows. His childhood was ordinary in all the ways that matter: school, chores, big family suppers. When the war came, he was still more farm boy than soldier. His mother packed his duffel bag with more worry than clothing. She slipped a small Bible between rolled socks when she thought he was not looking, hoping that faith might serve where her hands could not. On the platform, his father shook his hand a little longer than necessary. Bill understood what that grip meant, though neither of them spoke about fear or possibility. He boarded the troop ship wearing a nervous smile, the kind a young man puts on when courage has to look convincing. The Navy had stamped the word Coxswain on his papers, the very title marked on the helmet he now holds. But it felt larger than he was. In training, he had practiced guiding those flat-bottomed boats through bad surf and worse luck. Yet no amount of practice could prepare him for the weight of 30 men standing behind him, trusting his hands with their lives. He remembers the first time he tried on that steel helmet on the ship's deck. The metal sat oddly on his head, dipping low until he pushed it back. He joked it made his ears stick out. His friends laughed, grateful for the brief escape from uncertainty. On calm nights, he sat on the open deck with James and Murphy, sharing a cigarette in the wide silence of the ocean. Together they spoke of pie cooling on kitchen windowsills, of Sunday church bells, of girls who might send letters, maybe. Those nights carried a thin peace. Beneath their talk, though, lay a quiet knowing that the ship was steaming toward something far from farm fields and warm kitchens. Bill would sometimes thumb at the rough canvas of his chin strap, feeling it scrape gently under his jaw. It was a habit, a rehearsal for a moment he could not name. Waves tapped the hull with a rhythm that soothed and unsettled. Rumors of an invasion drifted through the bunks like cold air, never solid but always there. Still, James found room for hope. He pressed a small photograph of his fiancée into Bill's hand one evening, asking him to tuck it beneath the sweatband of his helmet. "For luck," he said. Bill nodded, folding it carefully where the metal rim met his skin. Murphy, quieter than the rest, traced the rim of his own helmet with one fingertip and remarked that it might be their only roof for a while. They all understood what he meant. Later that same night, while James and Murphy slept, Bill sat awake, listening to the engine's thrum like a distant heartbeat. The helmet rested beside him, heavier now with the photograph inside. In the dimness, he thought of Wisconsin fields lying still under the moon, frost on fence posts, haylofts warm with the smell of animal breath. He wondered how a boy from there had followed orders that led him here into dark seas and a future drawn tight around duty. The thought was not bitter, only bewildered. Lights dimmed for blackout, and the ship felt like a shadow gliding over endless water. Bill reached into the dark, touched the helmet, and felt the cold steel answer him. It grounded him, a quiet reminder that tomorrow could change everything. In that silent reach between bunk and rim, the war was still far away. The bond between the three of them, Bill, James, Murphy, had already tightened. Years later, he would understand that those quiet nights were among the few things he refused to forget. None of them said it. But each knew he would rather die than be the one who didn't come home with the others. Dawn arrived low and gray on June 6th, as though the sky itself wished to stay hidden. It pressed close to the sea, and for a moment the whole world seemed to hold its breath. It was D-Day. Omaha Beach waited ahead, though none of the men yet understood what that name would come to mean. From the deck of the transport ship, the French coast appeared harmless, a pale line against dark water, distant and still. No smoke, no fire, no reason to believe that sand could become a wound. Bill dressed quietly, tightening his life jacket until the straps dug into his shoulders. With both hands, he settled the steel helmet on his head, pushing it down until it felt steady. Inside the metal, he could smell sweat, a trace of oil, and the faint sweetness of James's photograph tucked beneath the band. He touched the edge of it with one fingertip before lowering himself into the coxswain's position behind the wheel of the Higgins boat. The helm felt colder than he expected, as if the night still clung to the steel. The men boarded in heavy gear, boots ringing sharply as they descended the ramp. Each clang echoed in Bill's chest. Among them was Murphy, adjusting his helmet with a quick, practiced motion that cast his young face into shadow. James appeared next, offering Bill a crooked grin meant to steady all of them. Bill returned the smile, though something in his stomach twisted. When the boat was lowered toward the choppy water, the steel walls rose around them like a narrow canyon. Breath felt loud in that confined space. Spray hit Bill's cheeks, salt and cold, while sweat gathered in his palms. The engine started with a growl, the vibration rising through metal and bone. No one needed to speak. The noise filled every gap where doubt or comfort might have been. The sea ahead jumped with flashes of white as shells struck water. Far off on the cliffs, tiny sparks bloomed into sharp light. Muzzle flashes, artillery, something deadly. Bill's training repeated itself like a stern voice. Keep formation, keep speed, drive straight to the beach. Do not swerve, do not stop. But another voice, smaller yet unmistakable, whispered to slow down just a little. One moment more of safety, one breath longer before chaos. A hiss sounded as something sharp struck Bill's helmet, a fragment maybe, and rang like a hammer on a bell. The thin steel held. He felt its tremor anyway. Behind him, someone retched. Another voice began a prayer that broke into coughing. James shouted something about home or pie, or maybe both. Bill couldn't be sure. The words came to him in pieces, cut apart by engine noise and explosions. The shoreline thickened as they drew closer. Not a distant strip now, but wet sand waiting like a held breath. Bill's hands tightened on the wheel. In that stretched second, no longer than the beat of a heart, he could have eased the throttle. He imagined falling back behind another boat, letting someone else break the line first. He imagined weaving, making themselves harder to hit. A cowardly thought, perhaps, but also a human one. He pictured what slowing would mean. Their boat exposed, others forced to shift, formation twisting apart under fire. Men dying because of hesitation. The image came quick and bitter. He was 19. The choice was older than he was. He drew one sharp breath and pushed the throttle forward. The boat surged, slamming against rough water. Each impact jolted through his legs, rattling teeth and thought. A moment later, gunfire tore the water where they might have been. Bill did not speak. There was no room for words. The distance collapsed rapidly. 50 yards, then 30. "Get ready," someone shouted, and the men braced with rifles, straps, crosses, anything solid enough to hold. The front of the boat hammered downward. The ramp crashed open with a violent metallic slap. Sunlight and noise and sand spilled in at once. The first man stepped forward and fell before his boot reached the beach. Another followed, then confusion and movement blurred into one another. Bill saw James turn, eyes wide with something between courage and fear. And then a plume of water and sand took him from sight. Murphy's voice rose somewhere near the bow, or it was Bill calling his name. Either way, the sound dissolved into the roar around them. Bill wanted to leap down, to pull someone back, to reverse the boat and flee from that hungry shoreline. But his hands held steady to the controls because that was his duty, his burden, and because movement was the only mercy he could offer. The ramp emptied of voices, though the air still shook with gunfire. When the last man stumbled off, Bill reversed the Higgins boat. It pulled away from the shore with a groan, the tide stained red, the deck slick. He could not count how many had run or fallen or disappeared. The engines throbbed under him, carrying back more emptiness than survivors. Behind them, Omaha Beach continued a noise he would hear for years. Ahead was only gray water and the next return. Bill steered, jaw set, breath shallow. There was no cheering, only the work of turning back for more. That short morning lasted his entire life. Its weight was something he refused to forget. When the war finally released him, Bill stepped down from the train into a Wisconsin morning that smelled of wet earth and fresh coffee. The platform was busy with embraces and voices. But he stood still for a moment, as if unsure the solid ground beneath him was real. His mother found him first, pulling him close with a force that pressed the breath from his lungs. He did not tell her that the clap of a porter's hand truck nearby made him flinch. In town, people called him our hero. They shook his hand with pride, clapped his back, told him how brave he must have been. Bill nodded, answered kindly, but their words slid over him like water over stone. Inside, he felt oddly cold, as though the warmth around him could not reach farther than his skin. At church, the pastor spoke of sacrifice and victory. Bill stared at the stained glass, but in the colored light, he saw waves, gray sky, and the pale strip of sand instead of saints. Life moved on. He married a kind woman who loved his quiet ways, believing them steady rather than scarred. Together they bought a small house with a yard and a garage. The garage was spacious, full of tools and paint cans. Far from the cramped steel space he still steered through memory. Bill wrapped his helmet in a blanket, placed it into a wooden box, and set it high on a shelf where he could forget it, or try to. At supper, his children sometimes asked, "Daddy, what was the war like?" Bill would smile softly and say, "I drove a boat, that's all." The small answer satisfied them because children do not yet hear what is missing. His wife, though, paused with her spoon halfway to her lips. She knew the silence between his words. Radio news would crackle with engine noise or artillery tests, and Bill would set his fork down, stare at nothing, and wait for the sound to pass. Dishes clattering in the sink could sound too much like helmets sliding across a deck. On holidays, when fireworks split the night, he would slip out to the garage with an excuse about tools or paint. There, sitting on an overturned crate, he waited for the echoes to fade. Many times he lifted the wooden box, opening it with care. The helmet inside sat quiet, its dull curve catching its own small circle of light. He would reach in, hold the rim for a second, then close the lid before memory grew too bright. Years passed that way. Once, his teenage son walked into the garage just as Bill held the helmet. Their eyes met, startled. "Is that from the war?" Bill nodded, but words stayed locked behind his teeth. 100 memories. James laughing, Murphy humming prayers, Omaha rising gray and loud, pressed forward, but he kept them back. His son waited for details, for something honest and heavy. Instead, Bill swallowed it down, like medicine too bitter to name. "Okay, Dad," the boy said, stepping away as though he knew better than to dig where pain might live. The moment stayed between them like a held breath. In that silence, Bill made a decision he would make again and again. He would protect his family by keeping them from the truth he carried. If he spoke it aloud, it might spill into their lives, stain their dinners and holidays and quiet mornings. Keeping it inside felt like penance, a way to honor those who had not come home. He believed he had no right to lay his memories on the table beside the salt and bread. So the house remained ordinary. Warm meals, children's laughter, Sunday drives. While inside him, the surf never settled. Omaha stayed gray and unfinished, a place without an end. His silence became a second uniform, one he wore without ceremony. It held years the way the helmet held dents. Sometimes he wondered whether forgetting would have been mercy. But the helmet waited, and so did the memories. Even in his gentlest decades, the quiet he kept was something he refused to forget. Years passed like pages turned without fanfare. The helmet in the garage gathered dust, silent and patient. While the children he once carried on his shoulders grew tall, moved away, and built lives of their own, Bill grew older, slower in the knees, kinder in his eyes. Time softened many things, but not everything. One 4th of July afternoon, the family returned. Sons, daughters-in-law, grandchildren with bright faces and grass-stained knees. The backyard smelled of charcoal and cut lawn. Burgers hissed on the grill, and potato salad sat in bowls beaded with condensation. Someone unfolded lawn chairs. Someone else found the old radio and tuned it to music from decades past. It was a day like countless American summers, full of chatter about weather, work, vacations, nothing urgent, nothing sharp. Bill sat in a worn lawn chair near the porch, a paper plate balanced on his knee. The sun warmed the tops of his hands. His youngest granddaughter ran in circles waving a small flag, her laughter skipping across the yard like pebbles on water. He watched them with quiet pride, the kind that comes from knowing the world could be worse. And that simple peace is a blessing. Evening settled slowly. Neighbors pulled chairs to the curb for the fireworks display. The radio hummed, soft and harmless, while the grill smoke drifted upward in loose gray threads. Bill took a slow breath. For a moment, everything was ordinary. Then the first firework burst. A white flash tore across the sky. This was Omaha again. No turning back. The sound followed an instant later. Loud, sudden, cracking opened the night. The noise did not echo like celebration. To Bill it came as artillery, sharp and demanding. His heart lurched before thought could intervene. Another flash, another report. The smell of smoke from the grill twisted into something older. Fuel, cordite, salt air. His plate slipped from his knee, food scattering across the grass. Bill stood abruptly, then dropped to the ground without meaning to, knees striking the patio hard. His hands flew to his head, seeking a helmet that was not there. The world around him blurred, his vision narrowing to gray water, shouting voices, a ramp slamming down. For a moment he was 19 again, salt spray in his face, lives depending on his hands. His grandchildren froze mid-play, unsure why their laughter had disappeared. His son rushed to him, arms around his shoulders, trying to steady him. "Dad? Dad, talk to me. What's wrong?" But the words felt far away, like someone calling from across a beach in a storm. Bill gasped, breath shallow, eyes wide. "Not again," he whispered. the words thin and frightened, a prayer not spoken in decades. Not again. Another fireworks sounded, but this one seemed softer. Not because it was less loud, but because the present finally reached him. His son's grip was warm and real. The patio was steady beneath him. He was not in a boat. He was in his own yard. Slowly, his breathing eased. The family gathered close. No one pressed him with questions. They only guided him inside, away from the bright sky and the echo of shells that were no longer there. The fireworks continued outside, but the living room remained dim and still. Later, Bill sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee cooling between his palms. His son sat opposite him, saying nothing, only waiting. Bill stared into the steam that had stopped rising. The house was quiet, yet inside him the engines were still rolling forward. The ramp still fell, heavy as fate. James still turned and vanished in sand and spray. He realized, not for the first time, that silence had not contained the war. It had only hidden it. And now it was seeping into the lives of those he loved, uninvited and sudden as a blast in the night. His chest tightened, not from fear this time, but from recognition. The helmet in the garage could not stay buried, not if he wanted his grandchildren to understand him, or to grow up knowing courage is not the absence of fear, and survival is not the end of cost. The night settled around them, still and kind. Bill kept his hands on the mug, grounding himself in warmth. The fireworks faded outside, color sinking back into dark sky. That night became another moment he could not erase, another memory his mind refused to forget. Only this time, he understood that remembering alone was no longer enough. The next morning arrived soft and slow, the house unusually quiet. The plates from yesterday's gathering sat, washed and stacked, the backyard chairs folded and leaning against the fence where dew would soon dry from them. Bill stood in the kitchen doorway for a long minute, hands resting on the frame. His family moved gently around him, coffee poured, toast buttered, no one asking, no one pushing. When the moment felt steady enough, he walked toward the garage. Not quickly, not with hesitation either, just slowly. Like a man who had decided something and was giving the decision the dignity of time. Unthank's light fell through the small window the same way it had years before. But the air felt different now, less like a place to hide, more like a place to face. He reached up to the high shelf, fingers brushing dust from the wooden box. It was lighter than he remembered, though the weight inside had never changed. He carried it to the workbench and eased the lid open. The helmet lay there as if it had been waiting, quiet, patient, unchanged. He brushed away the thin layer of dust along the rim, revealing the faint scratch of the word Coxswain. That single word had once felt too heavy to touch. Today, it felt true. He lifted the helmet with both hands. Even after all these years, the coldness of the metal surprised him. Its weight pressed into his palms like a memory taking shape. He stood there one breath longer, then he carried it into the house. His wife and son were already at the kitchen table, their coffee cooling slowly between their hands. They looked up when he entered and did not speak. Bill set the helmet gently in the center of the table, as carefully as one might place a family relic or a folded flag. From his wallet, he drew 2 small photographs, edges soft from time. He laid them beside the helmet. James on the left, Murphy on the right. For a moment, no one spoke. The 3 of them sat with coffee cooling between their hands, and the helmet waited in the center of the table like a question finally asked. "This was James," Bill said, fingertip resting lightly on the first photograph. "And this was Murphy." He paused after each name, giving space for them to exist aloud. His voice trembled, but it was steady enough. He did not speak of tactics, maps, or gunfire. Instead, he told them how James laughed with his shoulders, how Murphy hummed hymns when nerves tightened the night. He spoke of the smell of salt on June mornings, the feel of the wheel beneath his hands, the split-second choice to keep the throttle open. Several times his voice caught, Several times he breathed carefully, letting memories rise without overwhelming the room. His son reached out and placed his hand on the helmet, feeling each nick and dent. The small gesture, so simple, so human, gave Bill the strength to continue. His wife listened with quiet eyes, tears gathering but not falling, seeing at last the shape of the burden he had carried beside her for decades. Bill explained why the helmet had lived in the garage all those years, how he believed it didn't belong among family photos, how guilt made him think silence was respect. His son shook his head, not in disbelief, but in understanding. He told Bill that bringing it inside didn't glorify anything. It honored the men whose lives touched that steel, and the one who survived to remember them. Bill looked at the helmet then. Morning light rested on it gently, outlining each curve and scar. He felt something loosen inside. A knot that had been years tightening, not gone but eased. He thought of other men across the country with boxes in closets, medals in drawers, letters never read aloud. He imagined helmets in attics, boots in trunks, whole wars living in silence behind thin walls. None of them forgotten, only waiting. For the first time, he saw his story not as a burden kept alone, but as one thread in a much larger fabric. One that might help someone else breathe easier, maybe someday speak. Around that kitchen table, decades of silence softened. His memories, once locked tight, finally stepped into the light with the helmet that had held them. The story he carried for so long no longer belonged to silence alone. It refused to forget, and now so would they. Some weeks later, the helmet no longer sat hidden in the garage. It rested instead on a simple shelf in the living room, beside framed photographs of anniversaries, children, and sunlit vacations. It did not shine. It did not boast. It simply waited, a quiet witness to years that had passed and years still to come. Bill paused there often. In the mornings, when coffee steamed gently in his hand, he would rest his fingers along the rim of the helmet and whisper two names, James and Murphy. Not like prayers, not like apologies, but like someone keeping a promise. He spoke them softly, as if acknowledging that memory could be both sorrow and gratitude. His grandchildren grew used to seeing the helmet. As they got older, they asked questions in careful voices, and Bill found he could answer now. He talked about fear without shame, about duty without glory, and about how surviving is its own kind of courage. One afternoon, a grandchild looked up at him and asked, "Grandpa, were you brave?" Bill thought for a long time, steady and still, and answered, "I was just there." The child nodded, satisfied. The truth, simple and unadorned, was enough. The nightmares never vanished entirely, but they softened. They arrived less often, and when they did, the weight of them felt more bearable. On summer nights when fireworks crackled in the distance, Bill still paused, heart quickening. But a hand would find his, or a grandchild would lean close. The past didn't disappear. It simply shared space with the present, no longer alone in the dark. He came to understand that he was one of many. Men across the country with helmets on shelves or medals in drawers, each carrying their own tide of memory. Some would tell their stories, some would not, but all deserved space in the light. One evening, he stood in the garage again, door half open to a quiet street lined with mailboxes and garden hoses. The sea was still in his mind, never completely calm, but no longer drowning out the peaceful noise of the neighborhood. He breathed deeply, slowly. The guilt he carried was tied to love. And love, he realized, did not need silence as proof. When he switched off the light and stepped back inside, the helmet remained where family could see it. He had grown old, but the boy who steered a small boat through gray morning water was still with him. Steady, remembered. And at last, he no longer had to carry it alone.